Professor Boris recently stepped down as president of the International Federation for Research in Women's History. Next will be Senator Karen Keiser, who represents Washington State's 33rd Legislative District. For those of you that are outside the state of Washington, that is a series of suburbs south of Seattle, including SeaTac, Kent, and Des Moines. Senator Keiser is the chair of the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee, member of the Senate Health and Long-Term Care Committee, and a member of the Rules, Ways, and Means Committee. Senator Keiser has an abiding interest in policies to help working families and improve women's economic security. Senator Keiser will be followed by Perreira, who is the Director of Racial and Gender Justice, a newly created position at the Washington State Labor Council, AFL-CIO. Casey joins the Washington State Labor Council after 15+ years of organizing working people from the Bay Area to North Carolina, most recently as the organizing director and special assistant to the president of the United Food and Commercial Workers, AFCW 21 in Washington State. And last, but by no means least, Dana Barnett, who is the newly appointed Seattle organizer for Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network. And Dana is also the co-chair of the City of Seattle's Domestic Workers Standards Board. Dana spent the last 2 decades as a community organizer and a social and racial justice facilitator, working with a large variety of nonprofit, government, schools, businesses, and community organizations. I'm very excited to hear what they've got to say. And I'm now going to turn things over to Professor Boris.
Well, thank you, Kim. And thank you, Yasmin and Andrew, as well as the Bridges Center and of course, my sister panelists. Because, as a academic, you give me a platform and I go an hour and a half, but I will try very hard to keep my remarks to no longer than 30 minutes and perhaps less. For more than a decade, domestic workers and their allies have mobilized throughout the nation, including New York, California, Massachusetts, and of course, Seattle. And they've mobilized for Bill of Rights, legislation that places private household employees under various labor standards like wages and hours. Their success has occurred despite a reinvigorated and well-financed political right that has sought not only to starve the state and redeploy its assets to war, policing, and tax relief for the wealthy, but to undermine collective bargaining and reclassify workers as independent contractors, managers, or otherwise ineligible for labor standards, anything but an employee, fissuring the very employment contract. Campaigns for labor standards, we have learned, build power and consciousness crucial for future organizing. They also often help the workers that are covered. To gain coverage under the law, and thus use law as an aspirational and norm-setting tool for justice, requires visibility in the first place. Protest helps build support for standards or other policies, making hidden workers visible, and standards then can generate a framework for new mobilizations. Now, those who seek to organize care and other forms of household work additionally must confront historic legacies, not only the exceptional place of the home in representation and ideology, but the association of household labor with slavery and segregation, and the legal structures forged during the 20th century with the male breadwinner regime and a Fordist mode of industrial organization. Home labors appear as not really work, since anyone can do them, and should do them out of love and obligation. Thus, when paid, they really aren't worth much. And anyway, there's no shortage of workers. The devaluation of care work has persisted amid the commodification and privatization of the intimate accompanying neo-market neoliberal market fundamentalism, with care associated with affect, the ties that bind, with the characteristics of the labor subsumed into the identities of the workforce, predominantly in the US, female, Black, and immigrant. Care long has stood apart from worker employment, jobs covered by labor law. Struggles during the last decade or so have generated a paradox. The affect deployed in public debates to win legal inclusion circulates emotions that stick to care, the practice of love that has justified, actually, classifying care work as not work. So I'll have the next slide, just from, yeah. So I've written this book that takes the International Labor Organization as my archive. And why would an activist and academic who spent most of her career writing on the US turn to the ILO? Well, we've conducted these struggles for the recognition of care work and other forms of what I've called intimate labor in a globalizing environment in which time and space seem compressed. Capital labor seem transnational, and so too are social movements. In this context, I turn to the making of the woman worker under global labor standards. And I begin from this premise that the past of feminized labor, and I use feminized labor rather than women, part-time, temporary, low-wage, uncovered by labor standards of collective bargaining, opens a window into today's precarious world of work. But the regime built on the concept of the woman worker as different from the male worker, and the women in the global South as differences other, was never complete nor unchallenged. There were makers in the making of the woman worker, and to the definition of the home as outside of work. Global labor standards were one realm where definitions of what is work and who is a worker became forged to reflect and reinforce power relations between nations, regions, genders, race, ethnicities, and classes and castes. Nowhere is this more apparent in the operations of the ILO. And I want to give you a sense of what this Geneva-based specialized agency, first of the League of Nations and now the United Nations, is about, because the ILO is not very well known in the US. And the US actually has a very complicated history in relation to the ILO, but that's a different talk. So the ILO was founded in the aftermath of World War I by the Social Democratic French and British colonial victors in World War I as an alternative to Bolshevism. The ILO has addressed the world of work as a norm-setting body, and through its unique tripartite structure, that is, it's organized so that governments get 2 votes, organized workers get 1 vote, and organized employers get 1 vote. It was organized essentially to bring these delegates together to pass treaty-like conventions, which are aspirational counterweights to the vicissitudes of the market. The ILO's basic components, the International Labor Office that I refer to as the office, under an elected director general, the governing body, and an annual International Labor Conference, which is where these conventions are passed, has remained, even as the organization of the office, its civil service has changed over the years. What's important about the ILO as well, it is the body which generates knowledge. And those of us who are researchers and policymakers and activists often find ourselves using the statistics and the information that it has gathered. But what my study shows is that this gathering wasn't neutral. It came out of political struggle. Okay. So next image. So I want to talk briefly about the legacy of 1919, where we begin, and about labor, feminism, and the question of care. Labor feminists, that is, women in unions and governments and their NGO allies, shaped the initial labor standards impacting the woman worker. Indispensable to all working women and to mothers in the home. That's how the French organizer of garment outworkers, Jean Beauvoir, who's sitting sort of right center in front, characterized a proposal for the 8-hour day, the 48-hour week, which a century ago became Convention 1 of the ILO. And in doing so, she differentiated mother in the home from all working women. And that reinforces the separation of mother work from the world of employment. And this has haunted the formation of global labor standards. This binary, what some theorists refer to as productive and reproductive labor, others as paid and unpaid work, and the ILO is work and family responsibilities, cordoned off care from employment. And until the 2000s, paid care work mostly stood outside of ILO deliberations, while unpaid family labor became a concern as a means to enhance labor force participation and thus reinforce the valuing of care as a special kind of activity, one performed out of love or duty, that loses its effectiveness when commodified to allow others to go out to work. At least that's the theory. And what is fascinating is that we find many of the initial conventions that relate to the woman worker, maternity protection, restrictions on night work, on hazardous substances, are done in part to protect the woman worker as a mother, but also to enable her, if necessary, to go back to employment. Now, this devaluing of mothers in the home was not the intent of Beauvoir or the labor feminists of the early 20th century, and I'll have the next image. They really were attempting, like Mary MacArthur, which we see a statue of, or Margaret Bonfield from Great Britain. Bonfield was the first woman elected to Parliament and becomes a labor delegate from Britain to the ILO. Their intent really was to relieve the double burdens of working class women, whether they labored in the home or other workplaces. The need for time to care for children and perform housework rationalized restrictions on women's hours on the job in contrast to men, whose right to leisure was enough to demand an 8-hour day. Such responsibilities especially justified reducing the labor market presence of pregnant workers and those who had returned to jobs after giving birth. Indeed, labor feminists believed maternity protection, which included in their mind medical care and income maintenance, should be universal. Next image. The long image of women delegates shows a group of women who had a Congress of International Congress, sometimes here called Conference of Working Women, right before the first International Labor Conference in Washington, D.C., at the end of October, beginning of November of 1919. And a few of these women, like Beauvoir, MacArthur, and Bonfield, came to both conferences, and they really attended as labor advisors to their country's delegations. These women, as members of the Commission on Employment Women, impacted these early conventions. And they were present because the ILO's constitution suggested that countries have women representatives when questions involving women workers were under discussion. This is, of course, an essentialist understanding of gender and sex that pervaded reform communities no less than the general public. That is, women could represent the interests of women no matter their other identities. These were not intersectional understandings, as we would say in feminist studies today. The dominant perspective, however, within women's labor history has decried such women-specific labor standards as inhibiting equal employment. Such arguments echoed the legal equality feminists of the time that claimed that equal treatment would do. Special treatment by definition led to inequality. And in your right hand below is Alice Paul with some other legal equality feminists and the founding of the UN's Commission for the Status of Women. And the other images of the Open Door International, which was British initially. And the Open Door offered a promising alternative, however, setting standards on the basis of the nature of the work for men as well as women. That sounds like a great idea. The problem came from the persistence of occupational segregation by what I call racialized gender. The people by their race and gender, sometimes their immigrant status, were in some sense put into certain jobs rather than others. Most, and I'll have the next image, most ILO standards were gender neutral, but they had gendered and racialized impacts. Labor standards set perimeters to exploitation associated with employment, but some labor standards were really addressing what I call cultures of protection. They were about morality, sexuality, family structure, racial hierarchies, like the civilizing mission with colonies. Specific standards applied only to certain workers, signaled out by their gender, occupation, or geographical location. And delegates thus really from the nations that still had empires, that were colonies, always had loopholes to make sure that they didn't have to apply the so-called universal standards to their colonies. I'll have the next image. Yeah. The home in all of this was a loophole. It was seen as a place of the family. Wives and children and other relatives were working for the family, so you couldn't regulate within there, but there were ways to get around that. And the first really was the gender neutral minimum wage fixing convention. I love these titles, from 1928, that really was targeting low wage work, and particularly in the garment industry, for workers without collective bargaining. Many unionists embraced such conventions for other workers because equal remuneration and getting a floor under wages would protect the male rate for the job. Male delegates might wish to restrict night work hours, to reserve jobs for other men, or to protect women traveling in dimly lit streets as being accosted as women of the night, that is, prostitutes. Labor feminists, as I've suggested, had other reasons to, they understood the perils of overwork for women to have to undertake household duties after midnight. The one point about this is the labor feminists get certain conventions and certain standards, but they're ones in which the male unionists who have the power at the ILO agree to. Next image. Of course, the concern for caring labors transformed norms associated with one group of women in mind into a universal standard. And we really see this with the special conventions targeting places without sovereignty and where unskilled labor lacked organization. These are referred to as, quote, the native worker conventions. And if we look at the first one in 1930, the Forced Labor Convention, which really wasn't to end forced labor, it was to have rules so forced labor would become decent work, like minimum wages and housing allowances, etc. Part of the argument was that that these rules would limit the removal of men from their villages for too long, lest women become camp followers. Men spend their earnings on drink and prostitution, and village life become disrupted. And this is what I mean by cultures of protection rather than an employment-based labor standard. The idea was the women left behind, if they followed their men, they would become prostitutes. But next image. But even for the global north, the home provided a challenge for advancing women's rights. It wasn't just that domestic labor was like family labor, or those hired to be domestic workers were mislabeled as one of the family. Rather, the family responsibilities, or more accurately, the lack of private or public provision to accommodate them, disrupted employment. And so we have labor feminists in the early post-war World War II period, like Frida Miller, who's in the bottom, and Mildred Fairchild, who's in the top, pushing for revisions in the maternity leave, pushing for some accommodation to bring domestic work. They failed at that time, and industrial homework under labor standards. Miller was in this period under Truman, the US head of the Women's Bureau, and Fairchild was came from Grimoire, and she was an early social investigator. Next image. Well, by the early 1950s, the ILO had promulgated well-received conventions on equal remuneration. This is their Equal Pay Convention, which has about 150 ratifications, one of the most. But it's equal pay for comparable worth, really, in the way it's defined. But there are a lot of ways for countries to go about fulfilling it. Again, the flexibility to get these measures passed and also ratified. And then also next image, Convention 111, which is the anti-discrimination convention. And during committee deliberations for this convention in the late-ish 1950s, it's absolutely fascinating when you read these. The Irish government delegate, for example, admitted that his country would be unable to ratify this convention because to curb high unemployment, it barred married women from jobs, which he argued should not be termed discrimination. In contrast, state socialist nations claimed that women already had equality, including equal pay for equal work and protections such as maternity coverage. This doubleness of women being equal to men, but also needing special protections continued in the ILO throughout most of the 20th century. Okay, next image. We see this in 1965 when the ILO addressed family responsibilities directly by passing a recommendation, which is less binding, target to women in the very name. It was women workers with family responsibilities. Now it called for childcare facilities, coordination of transport and school hours with work schedules, public facilities to lighten household tasks, many things that we don't even have yet in this country and maybe never had. Some representatives offered a broader equalitarian claim. Quote from a worker delegate, Siegfried Ekendahl, who was a parliament member and a former head secretary of the Swedish Confederation of Trade Unions. She said, responsibility for the children and the family is in general the same for the man as for the woman. So some feminists in 1965 were objecting to having this concern with family responsibilities and their impact on the world of work being directed just to women. Next image. Well, by 1981, the ILO had made a gendered turn, and it began to talk about workers with family responsibilities. Now, the new instruments updated the impact of family responsibilities on Social Security and unemployment, and added job relocation for trailing spouses and adoption of parental rather than maternal leave. While some delegates claimed that discrimination derived from the sex of the worker, others argued that equality would mean nothing if employers could dismiss any worker because they had to attend to a child or other immediate family member. But only 19 countries ratified this convention within a decade. The countries complained that they lacked the laws, they lacked the machinery for enforcement, and several of them found implementation would actually violate equal treatment because women were getting special treatment to compensate for their family labor, even though the convention was being called workers rather than women workers. Next image. Well, when it comes to women in the global South, a dedicated group of feminist development economists recast reproductive labor of subsistence and informal workers as essential to economic life. In standard accounting, these women like Zuba Ahmed, Lourdes Perreira, the Marxist feminist economist from Spain, who taught many years at Rutgers and then Cornell, who was briefly at the ILO, and Martha Lofty, who got her PhD from Berkeley. Actually, Zubi got hers from PhD in economics from Harvard. They pushed for changing the definition of the worker to abolish the separation of so-called productive from so-called reproductive work, essentially resulting in defining housework as work. They understood how domestic labor directly facilitated capital accumulation. Unrecognized reproductive labor allowed for the low wages of the global supply chain. The program, I argue in my book, was a prefigurative initiative funding, and I'll have the next slide, major studies on women and development, many of them from researchers in the global South in conjunction with local groups. That is, it sought to decolonize knowledge through participatory research. And here's some of the work. Benaria's collection had researchers from around the world. And one of the most important studies to put industrial homework and home-based labor on the ILO's map beginning in the 1980s was Maria Mies's, the lace makers, Anasapur, which was funded in part by the ILO. Well, it took until 2013 for the Conference of the International Labor Statisticians to catch up with these developments. And then in 2013, it began to redefine work as activities, quote, that produce goods and services for household consumption, such as collecting firewood and fuel, fetching water, cooking, cleaning, and also providing care for children, the elderly, and other dependents. What the program in rural women beginning in the 70s was engaged in redefining. I'll have the next image. Now, the program recognized the sexual division of labor while exposing the ways that the male breadwinner, female housewife model really had little to do with the income generating projects directed to women in the informal sector in the global South. That women in so-named developing countries had distinct concerns never meant that they should not have equal treatment. And this included home-based and domestic workers who would demand inclusion in labor standards beginning in the 1980s. The image to the right is from the Self-Employed Women's Association of Gujarat in India, which were, and Sewa was central to the creation of the Home Work Convention of 1996. And if anyone wants to talk more about that, I can in the Q&A. This act of getting the Homework Convention set the stage to looking at home-based workers as workers who deserve the same kinds of labor standards as other workers, despite the uniqueness of their workplace. And it opened the way for the substance campaign, and I'll have the next image, of domestic workers. And it was the campaign of the domestic workers, which in 2011 led to Convention 189, Decent Work for Domestic Workers, that in some sense revitalized the ILO itself. And it's worth noting, taking a moment to look at some of the tactics that domestic workers who organized globally with the help of international labor federations and feminist NGOs and anti-slavery groups and anti-child labor groups engaged in. One is this claim of domestic workers are workers. They're not one of the family. They're not the help. They're workers. And the convention calls for freedom of association, right of collective bargaining, elimination of all forms of coerced or compulsory labor, and many others. Next image. And we can see some of the tactics, and they included organizational capacity building and training. And here is a WeGo, that's Women in Formal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, a group that came out of the struggle for home-based labor. The Marita Chen, who for many years was at the Kennedy School, Renata Jabala from Savoir were the co-founding members. And they realized that to get something across, particularly to convince some governments, because the employers really by this point said no to everything and tried to stop everything when it came to these kinds of conventions, you needed statistics, and you also needed to increase the capacity of women workers themselves. So here's an example. The woman in the middle is actually from San Francisco, from the Day Laborers Collective. One of the women next to her is from Peru. Okay, next image. Also something that wasn't done at the ILO previously, the women workers led by women from Asia mobilized in the streets of Geneva. So they were doing active social movement campaigning. And they would go through the streets. They brought a huge quilt, and they were actually disruptive in the state ILO. They would wear T-shirts that had messaging. They would sing. They had to be told to be quiet. But some of the women also got elected as delegates. So it was this insider outside strategy with women within the ILO office, as well as trade unionists from their countries that joined together to push for the domestic worker convention. Next image. They also used what I call the politics of affect. She works for her family as well as yours. This is not quite one of the family. This is showing the household laborer as someone who is a worker, but it is an appeal to the heart of the employer. Give her a day off, dignity overdue. Next image. And out of the struggle, the International Domestic Worker Network became a global labor federation with funding from the international secretariats, from the particularly the Food Workers Union, the IUF, the various fundraising from foundations. This is a movement of poor women. The first meeting was in, I'm going to be wrapping up, 2 images left, in Montevideo, and they founded a trade union. Next image. The ILO for itself, for its anniversary in 100th anniversary, decided to have an initiative in women's work, and they put care work at the center. At the same time, they were looking at digital platforms. So the issues, and I'll take the last image, that were significant for women workers and for what we think of as feminized labor sectors have persisted over this century. Minimum wages, social insurance, industrial homework, women's equality, who gets to be defined as a worker. And we could argue that in the process of relieving exploitation and correcting abuse, special treatment also threatened to maintain embodied hierarchies because of occupational segregation. But I want to leave you on an up note, and that is a quote from one of the domestic worker leaders. And as she put it, if I find this, we are the oil in the wheels. It is our work in households that enables others to go out and be economically active. It is us who take care of your precious children and your sick and elderly. We cook your food to keep you healthy, and we look after your property when you are away. Or as Myrtle Witterboy of the Domestic Worker Federation put it, slaves no more. Thank you.
I think I'm supposed to talk now, unless I'm misinformed, but if so forth. I want to thank Eileen Boris for writing a terrific book. And I want to thank the Bridges Center for bringing her to us and having this conversation tonight. I was so struck. I had just finished reading a book called The Woman Behind the New Deal, which was about basically a biography of Frances Perkins, the first Department of Labor secretary, the first woman to be in any cabinet post. And she had this run-in about the ILO, which was surprisingly all about immigration, in a lot of resistance to immigration from World War II during when the Jews were being persecuted and we didn't want to let them in. It ended up, at that time, immigration was part of the Department of Labor, and it ended up being taken away from the Department of Labor and put in the Department of State, which just goes to show you things sometimes never change. I am just profoundly affected by this situation we're in today that seems so connected to a century ago, 1919, 1920, and 2019, 2020. We seem to have a convergence going on between the centuries, and the book that Eileen brought forward brought a lot of those analogous situations to my thinking. Back in the early 19th century, the women were working at home, sewing, many kinds of seamstress jobs in piecework, and being paid without any kind of labor standards, without any kind of benefit. Well, today we have not just women, but all kinds of gig workers running around delivering Uber Eats and other TaskRabbit kind of products, and they're in the same fix as those seamstresses in the early 20th century. So sometimes it seems like nothing ever changes, or they just kind of reinvent themselves into a different form. There's other analogous thinking here, which is in the 1919, as Eileen mentioned, that time frame, the capitalist barons were really interested in avoiding a communist revolution in the US or France or anywhere else. So one of the ways they tried to clean up their act was under cover of these kinds of organizations, such as the ILO. Well, today, we're still a century later facing kind of the excesses of capitalism with income and inequality and the problems of racial and gender justice that are totally unresolved. And it's just two sides of, again, the same coin. The other thing Eileen brought forth in her book that was so timely to me was this differentiation between the legal equality feminists who wanted equality and weren't so concerned about protections, and the labor feminists who were trying to get labor standards for women workers. And it reminded me of a bill I sponsored, got passed into law about 4 years ago, called the Pregnancy Accommodation Act. And we walked a tightrope on that one because we got it passed into law, and it simply requires employers to provide pregnant employees such things as a chair to sit on and a bathroom break when they need it and water to drink on the job. And we had really the legal advocates that are usually our advocates and allies be neutral. They were silent on that bill because it wasn't an equality bill per se, it was an accommodation bill. I'm looking forward next year because I'm trying some more worker protection bills, because I do think ideas and movements have to be translated into policy to effect real change. I call it the Health Emergency Labor Standards Act, because this pandemic, which is another analogous kind of thing between the 1919 flu pandemic and the 2020 flu pandemic, something is going on, I swear. So this Health Emergency Labor Standards Act, which I call HELSA, puts in state statute, if we pass it next session, I hope we do, whistleblower protections for working conditions. It provides for expanded paid sick leave and expanded childcare and all kinds of what I consider common sense protections. And you probably do too, but we don't have them yet. And that's the situation I find myself in, sort of perplexed and puzzled about how could it be a century later and we're still arguing and fussing and struggling over so many of the same issues. So I would say that when it does come to women and work, our work is never done. We've got more to do.
Thank you, Senator Keiser. My name's Casey. I'm with the Washington State Labor Council, and I think I'll be going next to give additional local perspective on what's going on with the labor movement here in Washington State. So I'm also going to share my screen and do a tribal or land acknowledgement as well in my ancestors' indigenous language of Tlingit. So if, I'm going to share that. Oh, hold on. All right, hopefully you all see that. And then I will translate into English. Ganeshjish shaya owadenehi, ganeshjish duamish, ganeshjish koselish, hinshawat ayachat, klekach henach Casey Marita Perreira, yuchat duasak. Cha'ak nachat seti hutzit ayahana kahidi. So what I just said is thank you, self-respecting people joining us on this Zoom today. Thank you, Duwamish. Thank you, Koselish, indigenous people of this land. I am Hinshawat, which means water woman in Tlingit. It was given this name by my father's friend, David, after his grandmother passed with the same name. She was an elder in our tribe. My English name is Casey Perreira. I'm of the Eagle moiety. Our clan house is Bear. Not only is this a practice that we encourage everyone to do, but particularly because we are all on Indigenous land, but especially given the topic of today's discussion and the systemic and institutionalized oppression of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, I invite you to join us in the continued learning, decolonization, and acknowledgement of historical violence of unpaid labor on stolen land. So as I said, I am with the Washington State Labor Council. I'm our Director of Racial and Gender Justice. We are with the AFL-CIO and have formed more than 600 union locals, councils, constituency groups, and worker centers here in the state, with about 550,000 rank and file union members and working folks in the state. Our president and secretary treasurer lead a body of affiliates and staff such as myself. We work in hospitals and nursing homes, auto assembly plants, construction sites, trains, buses, airplanes. We work security, we're engineers, office workers, musicians, electricians, farm workers, and many more, in addition to the work that we're talking about this evening. However, we also are covered under a federal law that's called the National Labor Relations Act. And the challenge is that there are workers excluded from that act, workers in the United States, and that workers that we're hearing about this evening, domestic workers, farm workers. Centering these people, centering these workers really lifts us all. Because when workers' rights under the National Labor Relations Act are withheld from some, it weakens those laws and the ability for all workers to assert their rights and build a labor movement to its full power. This flaw is by design. This is a system that was built to exclude some and fail us all. That inequity in treatment and pay and rights during the COVID-19 pandemic has only gotten worse. Roughly 3 out of 4 American billionaires have seen a rise in their net worths. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, who is already worth $113 billion at the start of 2020, is heading into the year's final stretch, $73 billion richer. So what are we doing about it? Just wanted to highlight a few pieces of projects that we're working on at the State Labor Council. The first is which is really the work that I'm doing is to support a group of affiliates with our Racial Justice Committee. We've been very focused on the training and education of union members and friends since 2015, where we passed a resolution at our state convention. In 2020, our trainings had to pivot, and so we developed this Lunch and Learn series, which is now all online. Additionally, we recognized Indigenous Peoples Day and encouraging folks to go beyond land acknowledgements and take action. Interestingly enough, I was at USCW 21 previously as the organizing director, and we had a project actually on ending sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And a lot of that work was inspired by what we learned happening at the international level with the ILO, and then here in the United States with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, who transformed harassment and violence against these workers into empowered women, immigrant women, Black and brown women that raise standards for all workers. So we had a member-led survey on ending sexual harassment and gender-based violence and produced this report. We have a narrative as well on race to labor that was written by Bill Fletcher in partnership with our State Labor Council that's available on our website if you'd like to read. And then finally, we have a Filipino American History Month that just wanted to encourage folks to learn more about the contributions of Filipinas. And you may see a familiar face locally, Cindy Domingo here, that was on a panel recently hosted by Wing Luke. And finally, just wanted to share with you something that was just launched yesterday. The Washington COVID-19 Immigrant Relief Fund was established after months of organizing and leadership. Check out the website, immigrantrelieffund.org. And also wanted to encourage anyone on this Zoom that is bilingual. It was just launched yesterday and 11,000 people have already applied since the application went live. We want to get this money in the hands of folks that need it. So if you are available or have friends, can share this, spread the word. This is really truly a community effort. Affiliates such as Casa Latina, which is a part of the State Labor Council, and the executive director, Marcos Martinez, and many others have been doing the work. Dana's going to take it from here, so thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Casey, for sharing some of that bigger picture of marginalized labor in Washington. And I've been asked to come to speak very specifically about the work around domestic worker rights locally in Seattle. And I am with an organization called Hand in Hand, and I'm also, as I said, on the Domestic Worker Standards Board. And I was actually organized to join the Standards Board by Hand in Hand. I only recently became staff with Hand in Hand. Before that, I was organized as someone with a background in movement work, and as myself, somebody who employs occasional nannies and also a house cleaner to work towards domestic worker rights here around the Domestic Workers Ordinance, which I'll get into. So Hand in Hand is a national network of employers, of nannies, house cleaners, home attendants, and allies working for dignified and respectful working conditions that benefit employer and worker alike. And next slide. Thank you. And so Hand in Hand was really born out of campaign work. It was born out of work in 2010 to get the first state domestic worker Bill of Rights passed. And that was a worker-led movement. And there was, through an organization, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and others, organized folks who were allies to workers or employers of workers to testify and speak about and support domestic worker rights, and realize that they had an important role in doing that. And so out of that, Hand in Hand was born. And Hand in Hand focuses on domestic worker rights, passing those types of ordinances, but also that leads us to work also on immigrant rights, affordability of care, and disability justice, because as others have said, this issue of domestic workers, of work in the home, is at the intersections of so many different forms of oppression. And while we organize people around, in some ways around privilege and positionality and leveraging that, it's also not just allyship work, but work that we believe all of us have a stake in, that we all have a stake in domestic work and care being valued and seen as skilled and essential labor, whoever it's done by, paid or unpaid. Next. So in Seattle, this work has really culminated, the work for domestic worker rights, around the Seattle Domestic Worker Ordinance. And that ordinance was passed a little over a year ago. And again, it was the result of worker organizations, led by groups like Casa Latina, SCIU 775, and Working Washington with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and with Hand in Hand organizing employers to support that work. Next. And so out of that came the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. And I don't know if we really got into it, that in the US, domestic workers were excluded, and also farm workers from in 1935 from very basic labor standards, and also from discrimination, sexual harassment. So this Bill of Rights really just does 5 things. I can get more into it. I'm happy to do that later at another time, but it really just gives these minimal protections and rights that workers, domestic workers, were very intentionally left out of. And it also creates the Domestic Worker Standards Board. Next, thank you. So the board provides a place for domestic workers. It's made up of domestic workers, of employers, of worker organizations, and employer organizations to come together to work around both about just improving the conditions for domestic workers. And so our role as a board is to both look at what still needs to be added as far as further legislation and policy, and also how can we really make these rights into a reality. Because we know, and what we find is that, once we, it was a great campaign to get this bill passed, but that's really only the beginning. It still needs grassroots movement. It still is a constant struggle to actually make these rights into a reality, to actually mostly to educate people that these rights even exist, both workers and employers, and to empower workers to be able to actually assert these rights, and to really empower and encourage employers to know about these rights and standards and to abide by them. And so, next. Thanks. So as Ana Torres, a worker who's a part of Casa Latina, recently testified in a Seattle city council budget hearing, more than 60% of workers don't know their rights, don't even know there's an Office of Labor Standards. So what we realize is that, there's so many different factors, as Eileen discussed and as others discussed, that really contribute to the invisibilizing of domestic labor, and certainly of workers. And so it really takes all of us to change that culture, to lift this work up, to assert that our bodies and our homes and our families, that care is work that needs to be valued. And so that really needs to continue. And it involves all of us, and there's a role for all of us in continuing that work. Next. So what next? You could bring a workshop to your community. I'm happy to come and talk more about both the ordinance, but also we have a lot of different resources for people about how to be an ethical employer. And join the Seattle network as a member of Hand in Hand, and help us to keep organizing around domestic worker rights in Seattle. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you to all four of you for such a marvelous set of comments. I enjoyed each of your remarks. What I thought we would do for a few minutes now is to perhaps have some crosstalk between us for a few minutes, and then I want to invite the audience again to submit some questions on the Q&A option, which you can see on the bottom of your screen. And we can address those in a few minutes. So one of the things that struck me as you all spoke was that each of you are highlighting the huge amount of work that to get legislation and policy in place. And that, first of all, I want to sort of thank each and all of you for your role in that. And so one of the things, and several of you touched on this, is to think about the sort of issues to do with enforcement and what roles the rest of us can think about with engaging with that. So I think this is something that we could have a chat about in a minute. But one of the things I think would be interesting to do is to see if Eileen wants to respond to any of those sorts of things, perhaps. Which is something I promised to do, and then I rushed ahead and didn't do that. So sorry, Eileen.
1 second, because I want to explain my background.
Ah, right, of course, yes.
Because I'm a member of Hand in Hand, and I just didn't feel like putting a UCSB background. And we had just gone through as part of the coalition of the California Domestic Workers Coalition to get occupational health and safety. The law in California, like the federal OSHA law, excludes household workers. And we had an amazing campaign led by the workers to change that between the wildfires and COVID, and Governor Newsom vetoed the bill. And I wrote something up about that you can read in the Hand in Hand blog. But the point I want to make is he relied on a couple canards. The first was the home. Well, it isn't like a workplace like other workplace, that the employers in the home, he doesn't even call them employers, those in the home, just aren't smart enough, he implied, to actually are knowledgeable enough to enforce OSHA, as if other employers know what is right to do. And finally, in essence, he said, well, the privacy of the employer was more important than the health and the safety of workers, who are predominantly women of color and immigrant women of color in California. So these issues are real, but I agree that enforcement is crucial. And whenever there's been enforcement, there's been groups, organized labor, worker centers more recently, and comrades, companions in the struggle, who like Hand in Hand, to make complaints. Because what was scary about this proposal ultimately, what was costly of it, is that workers would be protected from retaliation because they would have unions and groups like Hand in Hand and worker centers, the domestic worker groups, would take the complaints to the OSHA board. And he actually ignored that the law had been amended to have a study, which great delay tactic, but to get sector specific rules. So not every OSHA rule would apply to the sector. And so that's why the wage board, or in this case, the domestic worker board in Seattle, is so crucial. And that goes back to that convention, number 28 or whatever, on the minimum wage fixing machinery, because part of that highlights the wage board, which after all is a progressive era in the US, early 20th century, for women's labors was the wage board. And we're trying to resurrect the wage board for today.
Sorry.
Yeah, just
Do other people want to make a comment about enforcement? This seems to be a sticky issue. The hard work that goes into making the policy and the legislation, and then oftentimes I feel like what happens is like, check, did that. And so has anyone want to add things about the importance of enforcement and how we do that?
I'll just add that, oh, I see Dana, all of us want to add. I'll just say briefly that just, working people, but I think practically speaking, the people that are most impacted by this broken system or in fact is not broken, need to be a part of the framing and the decision-making at every step of the way, every layer, because I think sometimes as we organize and put all of this energy into a solution and then get it, in legislation, there's so much work that goes into it beyond there, and workers have to be included and not just at the table, but be in leadership as well.
Mm-hmm.
I would add that it seems somehow that my personal preference, I guess I'd say, is that if we have unions in place, they are a self-enforcing mechanism, because you have union grievances, you have union processes that can bring the complaint forward and resolve it through the mechanism of collective bargaining and grievance processing. And I just, having been in a union, I know that works. And looking at state government, I know that we will never have enough dollars to enforce every standard for every household. It just isn't going to happen. So we need to have independent or wage boards or other nonprofits or unions to be our partners in enforcement. And then we can get to that tipping point where the aha moment happens and people wake up to it. I will say we had a domestic workers' rights bill in Olympia in the legislature, and it was making pretty good progress. But we ran into a buzzsaw. It was the oddest thing from this organization it's a State Department program that brings in college students from other countries to be nannies. And I can't remember the name of it.
Au pairs.
That's it, au pairs. And they became so vocal. They were everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it was the most outrageous situation because the whole momentum for domestic workers got diverted to this really side issue of these girls, young women who come in to this country for a year or two to pick up more language skills and a little more experience in life. And it really doesn't affect, in my opinion, the professional domestic worker who goes to work for year after year after year in other people's homes.
I'll just jump in with one final comment. Thank you. I completely agree with what everyone has said, and that really the work of enforcement is about organizing, and it's about organizations. And I also so you already spoke to that really clearly. I think the only thing I would add to that is that part of that work also is bringing domestic labor out of the shadows, of really shining a light on it. I think that's what has this added element, right, of challenge and of vulnerability. But I think that's part of our work to have the ordinance in place does some of that work, right, of just acknowledging that this work exists, it is work. Mm-hmm. And then I think this other step is really to just make sure that every person who employs workers knows that their home is a workplace, that, every worker knows that they have rights. So that's a big step to enforcement.
And just a thought, Rebecca Saldana, Senator Saldana, worked on the domestic workers bill. Now that we have the pandemic limit on bringing people into this country, including au pairs, maybe we can bring that domestic worker bill back and not have that kind of opposition. Just saying, it might be opportune time.
Yes, I would love that. So actually that links into a question that came from the audience, and thinking about trying to remain on a hopeful note, I would say. The idea that, you know, the pandemic has highlighted a whole range of inequalities, and really, in a sense, laid bare issues around feminized labor, around women's work, whether it's in the home or paid work in the home or unpaid work in the home. And I'm just wondering if I'm being a little too hopeful. I'm adding to what the person asked. I'm wondering if I'm being a little too hopeful that this is a turning point. Please don't just say no.
We'll have to look back to know, but I do have this odd feeling about the confluence between 1919 and 2019, 2020. And I think we are facing a reckoning. And when you go through that, you come out, I believe, better. It just seems to me that we are now in a better place than we were in 1919, thank goodness. And the other big reckoning I've gone through was in the 1960s during the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War protests, and the women's rights movement. And we came out of that as well better. And then we have backlash. So that happens. That seems to be what happens.
So Eileen and Dana want to talk now, so that's great.
Yeah, well, there's another question in the Q&A that I noticed that that's a really important question that's being asked by Catherine Stewart. And Catherine asks that while she understands the pragmatism behind the move to make the value of domestic work visible by emphasizing how much employers' lives, health, families, etc., depend on it, this approach, which was also used by reformers in the 20s and 30s, seems fundamentally flawed by valuing the labor in terms of the employer's class privileges instead of workers' rights. And, you know, I agree with that, because domestic workers deserve decent wages and healthful working conditions and recognitions as skilled professionals, not because they love one's child or love one's elder, because they are workers doing a job. And I think this is one of the contradictions of some of the campaigning by using the politics of care, in which care is understood as affect and love rather than care in a more material sense. That's why I actually prefer the notion of reproductive labor, the work that is done to make people both daily and generationally. But that sounds jargonistic, you know? So domestic workers deserve to be considered workers and to come out of the shadow, not because they're caring, although often they care, but because they're doing work that is valuable, and that, like all workers, they deserve a living wage, like all of us.
Dana, did you want to, Dana, did you want to add something?
Sure. Well, I wanted to add something to the question before, which was just about this particular moment and what it offers. And then what Eileen said kind of added more nuance to it. But I'll go back to that one, which is just that I do think this moment offers us an opportunity because, like, speaking as a parent of a young child right now, and of, you know, the ways in which our demands to take care of reproductive labor or labor at home has been individualized so much in this, you know, in our system. And I think a lot of that is just being exposed now, the ways in which our our country, our society does not value or provide for us to manage that care. So I think that it does offer us this opportunity because this light is being shined on how impossible this work is when it just falls on individuals, and how inequitable it is when it falls on individuals.
Well, thank you for offering hopeful visions of the future. And I like the idea that we can move forward in positive ways. I think this is an interesting way in terms of thinking about lessons that we can learn partly from history, and then also bringing in the contemporary context of course. We have another question from the audience. I know we're running a little over time. I hope I can bear on everybody to stick with us for a little while. Why do women workers always have to prove their value to employers in order to obtain rights that other workers have gained by virtue of their human rights? Now, isn't that great?
All right. Have you ever heard of the word misogyny? I mean, women are discriminated against, and they have been discriminated against. They are discriminated against because they are undervalued as human beings. And that's the fact that we work with and deal with all our lives, from the moment we're born until we're dead. Where my mom knew it, I know it, and my daughter knows it. And we just keep working at it because it's the fact that we face.
I think additionally, intersectionality is real. Compounding oppression is real. So when you tie in the racialization, particularly of Black women, Brown women here in the United States, is just so distinct also, unfortunately, that we have to be actively anti-racist feminists in this work as well. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, I think just struck that so well. And I think that it's so important for us to continue naming, especially as, non-Black women, on how that impacts all of us and keeps all of us oppressed until we can undo it.
Yeah, my colleague, Zakia Luna, who's just written a book about women of color and reproductive justice and the use of the human rights paradigm, reminds us that the way human rights post 1945, say, with the UN, has come to in the US context, since it was born as a more general concept with the Cold War, is referred to as something that's out there, that it doesn't apply to us, that is domestically. It applies to other countries. But we know, as we're talking, human rights is being bashed in Washington, and that because of the existing inequalities, that some people are seen as more human than others. And that that sister song of Women of Color Reproductive Justice Coalition took on human rights as a framework, challenged this domestic understanding of human rights as something that was just outside of the US, and was a bridge to educating people on what reproductive justice would mean from an intersectional perspective. And that is connected then to the centrality of the relationship between production and reproduction, family responsibilities, employment, home, and work.
Well, we have more questions from the audience, as always, but I am mindful that we're running over time. I would love to do this again at some point. And I want to thank all of you. I mean, this was just wonderful, for a wonderful evening. I consider myself privileged to have shared virtual space with each of you. I am in awe. And behind the scenes, I want to thank Yasmin Ahmed and Andrew Hedden I couldn't do my job without the pair of you. And if you are on the line and you're a student at the University of Washington or in the Seattle area, indeed, if you're anywhere in the world and you are interested in labor studies, please visit us online at labor.uw.edu, and hopefully one day soon we'll meet you in person in the mezzanine level of Smith Hall at UW or somewhere else at the University of Washington when we open for in-person classes again. Stay safe, hug your loved ones if you can, wear a mask, and of course, vote. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.